Hello and welcome to the series Geodesy and Datums, the session on the new datums for the United States for 2022, presented by the Florida Surveying and Mapping Society GNSS Users Group. In this particular session, we're going to talk about the transition to the new datums of 2022 that are currently planned by the National Geodetic Survey. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the rationale, why this needs to occur, the various elements that are coming together that make this an important part of our national infrastructure, the activities that NGS is involved in to make this occur, and then at the end we'll look at the direct impact that it may have on your particular community and how you can figure out what these changes are going to look like in your backyard. So let's start by defining why. The slide that you see here shows a publication from 2013, the National Geodetic Survey's 10-year plan, which describes this process of changing the datum. It actually begins back in 2007. This is the second publication. The first publication was in 2008. But in 2007, the National Geodetic Survey convened a meeting of all the senior staff and said, let's get everybody together and look at where we are with the national reference frame and where we think we need to be 5 or 10 years down the road. What have we accomplished? What are the elements that exist in the National Spatial Reference System? And how might they be impacted by changes in technology? And what might NGS have to do to keep up with that? Now, if you've watched all the presentations in this brief series, you might have heard me say early on that during the 40-year career that I enjoyed at the National Geodetic Survey, I constantly watched as we played catch-up to measurement and positioning technology. And that has not changed. NGS has been doing this for 40 years and will continue to do that. Because as we all see, changes in positioning and measurement technology are expanding at nearly exponential rates. And the amount of users, the new disciplines that are taking advantage of these technologies is expanding. So there are whole new clients that NGS must serve, new demands for positional integrity, and we know there are going to be some major changes coming in the not too distant future. So this meeting in 2007, which resulted in a 2008 publication, NGS looked at the types of things that they need to do to modernize the agency themselves, the types of new people that need to be brought on to produce new products and services, and what do those products and services look like. And very likely the two most important elements of this, you can read the whole plan, there's lots of material in there, but there are two really big things that stand out. One is that NGS feels the need to be able to provide centimeter level positioning horizontally and vertically everywhere in the United States. So that's Maine to California to Alaska to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands to Hawaii and Guam. So that is a huge task. To do that, our current national datums, NAD 83, our horizontal and geometric datum, and NAVD 88, the conterminous vertical, the datum for the conterminous United States, as well as the island datums, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Hawaii, American Samoa, all have to be replaced. They all need to go away. They have a number of deficiencies that cannot be perpetuated. But this is going to be a big challenge. So we need to look at what those challenges are and how are they going to be overcome. Let's look at some of the defining issues. NAD 83, why is it a problem? Well, as a reminder, NAD 83, when it was originally published in 1986, was the very first national datum anywhere in the world to have its origin of coordinates at Earth mass center, Earth geocenter, because the satellites orbit about Earth mass center. Well, given the technologies that were available at the time, late 70s, early 80s, our knowledge of the location of Earth geocenter, that is, how well could we measure where Earth geocenter really is, gave us a value that was roughly about 2 meters, 7 feet. Not bad. It's a big planet. 2 meters was pretty good. That's roughly circa 1982, 83. In the intervening 30 years, our measurement technology has moved us from 2 meters down to roughly about 2 to 3 centimeters. Centimeters. So the National Horizontal Datum of the United States, NAD 83, while geocentric at its heart, is not as geocentric as it could be. Roughly about 1.5 meters. And I'll show you that a little bit later. Why is that important? Do you see it? The average surveyor never sees this, because in the vast majority of cases, the measurements that you typically make with a GNSS receiver are over short lines, a few kilometers, a few miles. Rarely does the average user, whether you're a surveyor or not, make a measurement from Des Moines to Bogota, Colombia. That just doesn't happen. That's a scientific process. So you don't do that. So the average user never sees this. But it's a big issue and will raise its head in the very near future, and NGS wants to be prepared for that. In addition, NAD 83 is not terribly well defined with positional velocities. Well, we know everything is moving, but NAD 83 in general is defined as being fixed and stable on the North American tectonic plate. Now, when you get to places like California, Western Washington and Oregon, parts of Alaska, that has a greater impact, and the coordinate system out there is in fact time tagged periodically to take care of issues there. But for the majority of the United States, it's assumed that the plate is moving at about the same rate, which to one extent or another, in general, it is. So the horizontal or lateral velocity of the North American tectonic plate is not radically different from parts of Utah to Maine. It's roughly about the same number. On the vertical side, NAVD 88, well, the overwhelming majority of the realization of NAVD 88 in most communities are the benchmarks, the passive marks in the ground, and the overwhelming majority of them have not been re-leveled, remeasured in, as the slide says, 40 years, sometimes 50 or even 60 years. So are those marks in the same place? Do they define the same height? Well, we know that many areas of the country are undergoing either subsidence or uplift due to a variety of different conditions, such as the post-glacial isostatic readjustment. Right? So the glaciers came down about 100,000 years ago. They depressed the crust, and roughly about 10,000 years ago, they start to recede. The land under the glaciers is now rebounding, it's uplifting, and much of the area that was pushed in front of it, the forebulge, it had uplifted and now it's subsiding. Other areas such as fluid extraction, sediment loading, so you have rivers that come down. Let's take for example the Mississippi River. Over time, historically, rivers like the Mississippi would tend to wander and deposit their sediments over large swaths of territory. Well, the rivers were also dangerous. So to improve commerce, we wanted to effectively straighten out those rivers, make them safe for navigation, and that's a good thing. But then what it does is it forces the bulk of the sediments to now be deposited in a single area. And that produces weight on the crust, it depresses the crust. We have sea level rise, which varies from place to place around the country. So we have a number of these changes that are going on that are not accounted for in the various leveling components that define the national reference frame. So here's an example of one. This is a map that I acquired from the U.S. Geological Survey that just shows in big, broad view the areas of the United States that are undergoing some form of subsidence. It's very well known down in the Gulf Coast. We saw this with Hurricane Katrina and other subsequent storms down there. Parts of Arizona, Maricopa County is well known. Certainly parts of California. California was highly impacted both in subsidence and uplift by the recent drought that's occurred there. Other areas such as the East Coast, the Chesapeake Bay area, where you have a considerable amount of sediment loading and a certain amount of fluid extraction. So there are many areas of the country that are experiencing some form of vertical motion. And the benchmarks in those areas are moving with those changes. And there's no process, given the current condition of the reference frame, to monitor or even mitigate, in some cases, those changes. That needs to be addressed. So let's look at the sort of the big gorilla, if you will, that's making these changes important to us. And that truly is the Global Positioning System, GPS, U.S. Navstar Global Positioning System. Okay, so this first satellite gets launched in February of 1978. And by the early 80s, 82, 83, people are already starting to make observations. The National Geodetic Survey performed the first active survey, geodetic survey, Summit County, Ohio, in, I forget, 82, 83. So some significant dates here. In May of 2010, the U.S. launches the first GPS satellite with L5. That's a third civil frequency. Today there are 12 satellites that can broadcast L5. L5, as I understand it from the Defense Department, will not be completely turned on until the constellation is complete. And I think the target date there is like 2022 or 2023, that we'll have a complete constellation and can start broadcasting L5. But next summer, here we are in July of 2016, next summer, 2017, the United States plans to launch the first Block 3 satellite, a complete new architecture of GPS. And it's anticipated by approximately 2020. Now, you see my question mark. Do I know it's 2020? No. Maybe it'll be 2019. Maybe it'll be 2025 or even 2030. We don't know. But it's entirely possible that we can start to achieve positional integrity with very cheap receivers, much like what you carry in your pocket right now. So imagine the potential for hundreds of millions of people to have access to a few centimeter positioning technology in their pocket. This is coming. And this is going to be a challenge for the National Spatial Reference System. And when I say they'll have that kind of positioning, it means no ground control. They're not tying into passive controls that I mentioned in previous sessions or into continuously operating reference stations. This will be just walking out with probably a cheap little handheld receiver. They might need a little antenna that'll stick in here somewhere. But it's entirely possible we're going to see those changes. When those changes happen, not if, when they happen, now, all of a sudden, the fact that NAD 83 is not as geocentric as it could be, that 1.5 meters that I mentioned a few slides ago, it's going to jump right up. In addition, let's make the math easy. If we can achieve 10 centimeters in a cheap handheld device, and we are on a platform that in general is moving about 1.5 centimeters a year, well, it's not hard to do the math. 10 divided by 1.5 means roughly about every 6 years, a little over 6 years, you'll be able to detect plate tectonic motion with what amounts to A cell phone. So NGS needs to be in a position in which they can develop methodologies, products, and services that can deal with, because the user demand is going to be very, very high. And they want to be able to do this as quickly as possible, not have to wait 5, 10 years down the road past that to improve the reference frame, as they have had to do on a number of occasions in the past. So a very quick look at GPS-3. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's very exciting. The potential for GPS-3, certainly the increased lifespan for the GPS satellites, although they're quite good now, they're going to be even better then. Notice where it says autonomous positioning, roughly 63 centimeters, 95% confidence. I got that right from the Air Force website. So they're already saying it's going to be better than 1 meter. And I think it's fairly safe to say that they are highly pessimistic about what they do. They kind of cover themselves with this, and I think most people in the positioning community could easily say, oh, 20 centimeters is doable, maybe even 10 in the not so distant future. So the near-term capability for this is quite exciting. Right? Now we must remember that we're not just talking about just GPS. We are in fact talking about GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System. And that's comprised of the US Navstar Global Positioning System, the Russian GLONASS. GLONASS was put up about the same time as the US GPS. Both were done as strategic tools, although today they both acquire a significant civilian component to them. The one problem with GLONASS, or one of a number of problems with GLONASS, is their lack of tracking network. But that's probably going to be solved in the next several years, I would suspect. But right now, there's not a good ground tracking network for the GLONASS satellites, such as we enjoy for the Global Positioning System. The European Union, Galileo, they've been very aggressive. They currently have 10 operational Galileo satellites. They anticipate 30 by the end of 2019. So we're looking at roughly 2.5 years from now, they'll have 30 satellites if they stay on track. We know the Chinese are going to be moving quickly with their system, Beidou, which is already operational regionally over Southeast Asia, but we know they're going to go global. And so roughly by 2020, the potential for 4 different constellations with upwards of 30 satellites in each one giving us position, timing, and navigation. So the near future is very exciting, but also very challenging for those of us who collect data and manage data, and the capacity to manage particularly historic data. So let's take a look at what we know about this global relationship. Let's start off with the relationship of NAD 83 to the International Terrestrial Reference Frame. Now in a previous session I talked about the ITRF. It's a product of the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service, headquartered out of Paris. And periodically they collect information from institutions around the world with a variety of different positioning and measurement systems, very long baseline interferometry, GNSS, satellite laser ranging, and DORIS. And out of that, they generate a series of coordinates for stations that participated in these solutions. And then individual countries can take that information from them and provide that information throughout their own national reference frame. And what you're looking at here is the data sheet for one continuously operating reference station, a CORS, that happens to be in Columbus, Ohio. And right at the top of the data sheet, you'll see its IGS 08 position. Now I just said ITRF 08. What NGS does is they use the GNSS only component of the ITRF, and that's referred to as the IGS. So the difference between the IGS component and the full ITRF, millimeters, a few millimeters. So for all intents and purposes, they can be considered to be virtually identical. Right? But since NGS is only worried about the GPS portion, the CORS, that they've decided to use just the GPS portion of the ITRF. So let's look at the positional difference for any course. And anybody can go do the same thing that I've done here. You just pick any course that happens to be in your neighborhood, one that you might be using all the time, and you can look at the positional difference between the global coordinate system, the IGS 08, and our national coordinate system, the NAD 83 adjustment of 2011, epoch 2010.0. So the data is provided in both Earth-centered, Earth-fixed X, Y, and Z coordinates, as well as latitude, longitude, and ellipsoid height. And if a station has been online long enough, NGS actually computes the velocity for that station. And that's what's happened here. A station in Columbus has been online for a number of years. So its computed velocity, you see it right here, northward, let's call it 2 millimeters a year. Eastward, negative, so that's west, 1.5 centimeters a year. And upward, minus 3 millimeters. So a minus upward is obviously subsiding. So the cores in Columbus, Ohio, appears to be moving laterally, roughly about 1.5 centimeters a year. And I previously mentioned that the bulk of the United States is moving about 1.5 centimeters. It varies a little bit about those numbers, but that's a pretty good rough ballpark number for most of the U.S. Obviously, whether or not it's moving up or down, that's an entirely different issue. And this appears that there is some subsidence there. What's the nature of that subsidence? What causes it? Well, that would have to be investigated locally. Below that, you see the NAD 83 2011 position. This is the most contemporary value of our national coordinate system and the values that most surveyors and others would be using if they're submitting data to tools such as the Online Positioning User Service, or perhaps they're using a real-time network. And notice that there are velocities on NAD 83, but they are considerably smaller at the millimeter level. So what that shows you is that even the North American datum, while it's considered to be fixed and stable on the plate itself has these tiny little motions. So absolutely nothing is stable, even if it's only at the few millimeter level, which you might consider to be almost at the noise of the data. What's the difference between these two? What NGS is saying is our national coordinate system really needs to be this or closer to this. Our national coordinate system means to be closer to the ITRF, yet it's these values down here. What is the difference between those? So what I've done here is to compute the difference between these using the NGS utility inverse, and here you see those values. The horizontal difference, 1.02 meters, so roughly 1 meter in the horizontal component. The ellipsoid height, quite simple. Just subtract 1 from the other here, and you see it's 1.2, a little over 1.2 meters. So roughly about 1 meter in each component. So our national coordinate system, our geometric coordinate system, needs to move from these values here to these values up here, or something very close to this, whatever the ITRF is going to look like in 2022. And we can consider that it's going to be very, very close to the values we see now. It's not going to be meters different, certainly not going to be tens of meters or hundreds of meters different as we saw going from NAD 27 to NAD 83. It will be much more in the range of just a few centimeters. So here is a good ballpark number. When we look at what are the changes we can anticipate in 2022, this is one way to look at it. And it gives us a good feeling of what those changes are going to be about. What you see on this next slide is just a generalization of what this difference is. It's mostly an offset in our knowledge of Earth geocenter. I said in previous solutions that our knowledge of Earth geocenter was about 2 meters before. I just recently mentioned that it was about 3 centimeters. And in the conterminous United States, that's about 1.5 meters different, plus or minus 0.2. And there you see the values for Columbus. And let me back up. How would you compute that? You would simply take this x, y, and z, Earth-centered, Earth-fixed coordinate here, and difference it with the values in NAD 83, and then simply take the square root of the sum of the squares over here, and you see the offset as computed in Columbus, Ohio, roughly about 1.6 meters, which falls right in line with what I'm saying is for the conterminous US. Some values slightly smaller or larger depending upon where in the country you might happen to be. But in general, for the conterminous US, we're looking at roughly about 1.5 meters. Now, this slide is very simple. It doesn't show that there's a rotation in there, but trust me, there's a slight rotation as well. And again, these data come from the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service, and I would recommend that you take a few minutes to look into the IERS and what it is that they do. They are an institution headquartered in Paris. They collect this information from organizations, academic institutions, national institutions, survey and mapping and geodesy institutions from around the world, and then periodically they will generate these new coordinates and Earth orientation parameters, which each individual country can acquire and use as they see fit. The first ITRF was in 1988, and the most current is ITRF 2014, which was actually released in January of this year, 2016. In terms of velocity, again, I mentioned that the velocity at Columbus is about 1.5 centimeters, and I showed you that right on the data sheet. What you see here, these little black arrows, these vectors that you see here, all come from a CORS, a continuously operating reference station. So here's our lateral motion for North America, and you can see that for the most part, the bulk of North America is doing this lovely little sort of southwestern rotation. Seems to have some kind of an origin down here around Yucatan, and maybe it has something to do with the Chicxulub crater down there with the meteor that landed so many millions of years ago. I don't know. All I know is that there seems to be this little southwestern rotation. It seems to be very, very systematic over most of the country. Of course, you get out to the western U.S. where we have the San Andreas Fault and other active faults. You have the combination of the North American plate and the Pacific plate, which are grinding against one another, and we get significantly larger velocities. You look up in the northwest, and we have the subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate up under areas like Seattle, and causes the mountain range to grow up out there. So we have these different values in these parts of the country, yet the bulk of the country has a rather systematic change. Alaska, well, you get to Alaska, things are just crazy. And look at the vertical as well. So many parts of the community, the data in blue is subsidence, the data in red is uplift. And what you see again, each one of these are stations that are either part of the NGS CORS network or they are part of data we share with our colleagues in Canada. And notice the significant amount of uplift that our neighbors to the north are seeing due almost exclusively to post-glacial rebound. And when we get down into most of the U.S., now we see areas like a Chesapeake Bay where they're subsiding from fluid withdrawal and sediment loading. The Gulf Coast, a lot of fluid withdrawal and sediment loading. So various parts of the country are undergoing some form of motion, and that needs to be taken into account by an active reference frame if we are to achieve 1 to 2 centimeters at any place, any time. Now, when we look at the potential for what the positional changes are going to be, just roughly speaking, the horizontal or lateral positional changes will be somewhere in the range of about 1 to 1.5 meters or so. The least amount of change we'll see down in Florida, the largest amount up in the Northwest. And if we look at that same condition for the ellipsoid heights, we notice the values are about the same, they just happen to go in the opposite direction. That's all. The largest changes in the ellipsoid height will be down in Florida, the most or the least changes will be in the upper northwest, although what you'll notice in a moment is that's the change in the ellipsoid height, not the orthometric height. And that's going to be an interesting little phenomena. When we look at gravity data, global gravity data that's been produced primarily by the GRACE satellite system, what NGS noticed was that there is an inconsistency, a mismatch in NAVD88, the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. There's a tilt to it. This does not mean the leveling was bad. The leveling was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It has to do with a number of different things. One is the processing of the data. Much of the leveling data needs to be, well, it needs to be processed with good gravity data, but we lacked good gravity data for many parts of the U.S., especially in areas where it's very challenging to collect that data because it had to be done terrestrially, on the ground. In addition, in adopting one single point to define the vertical datum of 88 at Father Point, up here in the mouth of the St. Lawrence, we adopted an equal potential surface that is more consistent with sea level on the east coast than it is on the west coast. And the difference between east and west coast in terms of sea level is somewhere in the range of about a meter. So when you see these values, part of that is an artifact of the difference between global sea level and what was defined for NAVD88 by simply picking one station at the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Now, in the previous session that you may have watched on vertical datums, I talked about the geoid models. And I spent more time in that presentation talking about this aspect of it. That is the composite or hybrid models, because that's what's being used today. If I want to get good GPS-derived heights, what do I have to do? And what has NGS done to create these models? Well, whenever they do a geoid model, the most current being Geoid 12, 12A, 12B, they start with the best gravity data in their holdings. I mentioned in the session on vertical datums, that gravity data does not match NAVD88 very well. So, to get from that gravity data to something that matches NAVD88, we collect GPS on benchmarks around the country, and the NGS creates a surface. They warp that best gravity data to fit NAVD88. But that's not what we want to do in the future. We want to look at a purely gravimetric geoid because we want our heights to be based purely on gravity data. That's what we really want. It's what we've always wanted. It's just been incredibly difficult to collect. So NGS has always started off by first generating a geoid model that is purely gravimetric data. So if you're a surveyor out there and you're used to using something like Geoid 09 or now Geoid 12A or Geoid 12B, you will also find, if you look on the NGS toolkit, that there's a corresponding gravity geoid. USGG, US Gravimetric Geoid 09, and that goes with Geoid 09. USGG 12, which goes with Geoid 12. Right? So whenever they generate the model, they use the best gravity data that they have, and then they apply this corrector surface to fit NAVD88. And that has, as you'll see in the next slide, and as you would have heard in my previous session on vertical datums, it's worked fairly well in communities where there's a lot of GPS on benchmarks, not so well in the majority of the country where there's not so much GPS on benchmarks. So the move is now towards a purely gravimetric geoid. And one of the ways NGS is doing that, and I'll actually show you how to utilize one of those, is periodically, once a year, based on the new gravity data that they are collecting, they must generate a new test or a beta geoid model. And it's typically referred to as X geoid, then followed by the year that it was generated. So there was X geoid 14, A and B, the A part being the gravity data that NGS just holds, the B being that which was added by the new measurements. So there was an XGeoid 15 for last year, and just recently, we just haven't even had time to change this slide, just within the last 2 weeks, NGS has released a new one, XGeoid 16, which you will see in a moment. So every year until 2022, or until the completion of the collection of the gravity data, NGS will be releasing these beta models, these test models, so that users can evaluate what are the changes in the heights going to be in my community. So you can now sit down with your clients, all the people that you are responsible to, and say, hey, these are the changes we need to plan for, both horizontally and vertically. And whether you're in the private sector or you're in the public sector, either one, many of you are sitting on mountains of high accuracy geospatial information, and you're going to be heavily impacted by these changes. So let's look at the accuracy, the estimates coming from the National Geodetic Survey as to the current quality of the National Geoid Model, the current one being Geoid 12A/12B. Green is good, right? So areas like Minnesota, Florida, Carolinas, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Vermont, Wisconsin, Michigan, things are looking pretty green and pretty good, right? Many other parts of the country, yellow to red, not so good. Again, at the 95% confidence issue. These come directly from the National Geodetic Survey. So in areas where it's green, they're telling you, well, we think the 95 confidence, the geoid model is good to 4 to 5 centimeters. Not millimeters, centimeters. Right? Areas where it's closer to red, they're talking 8 to 9 centimeters. So if you happen to be doing GNSS work and you're out in Utah or Wyoming or the Dakotas or Texas, depending upon where you are, you could struggle to get good quality GPS-derived heights by using the current geoid model. And until and or if any of these other states would accomplish what these states have done, then the geoid models will stay the same. And it's highly unlikely that that's going to happen for a whole range of different reasons. There's no one reason why Utah doesn't do the same thing that Minnesota does. It just is, and it's probably not going to change. So we looked at this at NGS. The whole team of everybody that was involved in the National Spatial Reference System, we all sat down and we looked at things like this. And many of us were actively engaged with users in the local communities, and we said, okay, well, we can see why. We know that there's certain things going on with Minnesota, and they're very active in doing this, but we also have people who are working in New Mexico or Idaho, and they're saying, gee, it's a different world there. And there are different rationales and different communities and different users. So they're not going to do what Minnesota is doing, or they're not going to do what the North Carolina Geodetic Surveying is doing, or they're not going to do what's going on in Florida. But what we need to have a consistent vertical reference frame, a consistent geoid model. That doesn't mean that you're only going to get it if you're working in a state that's collaborating directly with NGS. It has to be as consistent as possible from Maine to California. Right? And we're not going to achieve that if we keep going in the same direction. Well, maybe it's just timing, but like so many changes in positioning and measurement technology, things just happen seemingly kind of quickly. And in 2007, NGS was able to acquire an airborne gravity meter, an airborne gravimeter. The idea being now is to mount this airborne gravity meter in an aircraft and fly gravity across the entire United States. Everybody agreeing that the best way to go about it would be to actually take a gravity meter out on the ground and perform measurements about every mile or so. Well, the reality is that's just not going to happen. There's no resources to do that. It would be a program that would just be totally impossible. So NGS develops this technique they're calling GravD, Gravity for the Redefinition of the American Vertical Datum. So the idea is to capture what they refer to as a snapshot of the gravity field. They begin in 2007, and as of today, the middle part of 2016, they're a little over 50% complete. They are actually a little bit ahead of target to hopefully have this completed by roughly 2020, complete airborne coverage of gravity for the United States. Now, once they've done that, then it's a matter of combining that data with space-based observations coming from the GRACE, mostly the GRACE satellite mission. So the GRACE mission gives us the broad, long wavelength view, you know, how features might look like from space. We've all seen that. If you look at the images of Earth from space, you see big pictures. You see the big wavelength elements. As you come closer down, other features start to pop up, and that's what we refer to as this intermediate wavelength. And then when you get closer to the ground, now those shorter wavelength, those smaller features, which are the ones that are really, really important but so hard to acquire, now combining the airborne, the space-based, the airborne, and then terrestrial observations with things like absolute gravity meters and even relative gravity meters, bringing all these observational pieces together to compute one gravity geoid model for the United States. And you'll see from the next slide, I've already said it's a little over 50% complete. The next slide says 48%, and that's only because the folks at NGS just haven't been able to steal a more up-to-date map from them. But I suspect that the areas that would be filled in would be these that you see in yellow, now filled in with green, because the data has been processed and made available. So we can see over 50%, most of the coastal areas, and that was really of primary importance, because one of the biggest problems that NGS has encountered with the geoid models is what they commonly refer to as a step function. That is, that we could measure the gravity pretty well coming down to the shoreline, and they would have some offshore gravity, some marine gravity data, but because of the turbidity of the near-shore environment, couldn't match that data together very well. Now they're going to be able to do that with this airborne gravity. In addition, we're overflying into Canada and Mexico so that we can collaborate and share data with our colleagues to the north and south and develop a larger array for the geoid model. The long-term goal, the really long-term goal, is that all of these data would include the Caribbean and Central America as well. And I must admit that until only recently, when we would talk about this at NGS, one of the biggest problems was, of course, overflying Cuba with airborne gravity. And perhaps now we may have some way to actually do that in the not so distant future. So this is let's take a quick look at what GravD is. When I tell you it's a process of collecting airborne gravity, well, how are they doing this? I'm going to give you just a snapshot of one particular project, and happens to be a coastal project. So they'll go in, they'll pick generally speaking, a small airport, because they don't want to compete with large aircraft and all the schedules that they have. In this case, you're looking at, it's again a coastal area, so they want to try and fly out around the coastal, break for the continental shelf. And then what you're going to see is the flights that they design. If you're familiar at all with photogrammetry, you'll look at it and you'll go, wow, that looks like a photogrammetric project, because it's very, very similar in its concept. Right? So they'll go out, lay out a number of flight lines, and then cross tracks so that they can validate the data that they've collected. And as you can see, there's the specifications for these, roughly 10K apart, crossing 60 to 80, and the flight altitude, etc. And some of these change slightly. But again, if you just look at it and you didn't know anything else, you didn't know this was gravity data, you might very well say, oh, they're flying photogrammetry. Airborne photography, but it's all being collected with gravity data. And the way they do this, using a number of different aircraft, the aircraft, a couple of them are owned by NOAA themselves. They collaborate with other organizations, BLM, Fugro, of course, Naval Research. And a lot of it depends upon where they're going to fly. If they're going to fly considerably offshore, they don't want one of these small guys. They want something with at least 2 propellers. Going out into places like the Aleutians, they're trying to hope to get the big boy like this. So it's a matter of, again, collaborating with other organizations, contracting some of this as well. And they've made very, very good progress on this. The idea being to come into a small airport, you select, working with the airport manager, they actually select a place for the airplane to park. Parking space, gravity tie. Right? So every day, that's where the aircraft is going to park. They establish a couple of GPS base stations and bring in the absolute gravity meter to make that gravity connection. So at the spot in the ground, you're just going to drive a nail in the ground, position it, bring in the one of the absolute gravimeters. Here you see the ones that commonly called the beer kegs, the A10s. A couple of base stations nearby, and then also observe the gravity gradient. And every day, it will come up, park the plane over that spot, and from that spot, which they can locate on the underside of the plane, they now know the orientation of the gravimeter itself, a TAGS gravimeter. That's a turnkey gravity system. Right? So it's basically you plug it in, you turn it on, and it does the work, connected to an IMU. Because the idea being that you need to take out the pitch, roll, and yaw of the aircraft, because you want to make sure you're getting the observation as close to straight down as possible, and the aircraft could be bouncing around like this, so the IMU helps to remove those error sources from the gravity data itself. All of this has to be linked together, so you bring all of the elements, you put them together in the aircraft, or bring in one of the surveyors, perform a connection between all of them, and then of course run out and do a test flight, make sure everything's working okay. And then once the data has been collected periodically, like once a year, NGS is now committed to generating a gravity data, what they refer to as a beta geoid model. So it's not the absolute model, it's not the one that's going to be the final, it's a beta, it's a test. And it's using as much data as they have at that time. And so now people can go in, if their area has been covered by the gravity data, they can go in and utilize these beta geoid models and look at how much are heights going to change in my community. And they generate a little model, a test. And it's quite simple to use, and I'm going to show that to you right now. As I mentioned previously, there was one that was just released. On July 21st of this year, NGS releases XGeoid 16A and B. And remember, the A and B stands for A means don't have the airborne gravity. B means, oh yes, we have the airborne gravity. And there's an online tool. Again, you follow the URL. It'll take you right to it. I'm going to show you how to do this. Okay, so here's the tool, the beta tool. And of course, there's a lot of verbiage in here that tells you how the system is defined and how it's working. And what you can do, depending upon where it is that you are, you can bring in data from your backyard. And right here, it tells you the different ways in which you can input the data. Degrees, minutes, and seconds, or decimal degrees, or however you want it. It has to be 3 components: latitude, longitude, and ellipsoid height. Now, I'm not going to just go in and type something in here. There's already a test data set here that's available with the tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and submit this sample data sheet. This is the sample data here. I'm just going to hit Submit Coordinates. And it takes a second. It's working. And now what it's going to do is it's going to compute the offset in both the horizontal, so each one of these, my input, NAD 83 2011. The output, IGS08. What it's doing is it's saying, here are your coordinates today on NAD 83 2011, epoch 2010.0, and now we're going to move them in time using IGS-08, even though we know there will be another IGS before then, but IGS-08 is going to be close enough to model with. We're going to move that in time to January the 1st, 2022. So this is IGS-08 epoch 2022.0, January the 1st, 2022. So what it provides you is, here would be your latitude and longitude results. Notice the difference. Here's your ellipsoidal height differences, and here's the geoid height separations, and it gives you comparisons. Oh, if you're using the current geoid model, Geoid 12B, here is the value. If you're using the most current gravimetric value, remember I said that's the one that has just the gravity data, here is that value. And then below it, here are the more contemporary values using the actual gravity data that's now been defined. And over here is the orthometric height. So what you can do is use this tool on a known mark in your community. So you have a mark that is a known NAVD88 height. You simply go in and provide the latitude, longitude, and ellipsoid height, just as you've shown in the test data set. Send it to the tool, and it will now send you back what it thinks is going to be the most logical orthometric height for that point on January the 1st, 2022, and then you simply do the comparisons. How much is it going to change where you live? And then you can step back from that and make assessments. Oh, this is where this has an impact. These are the programs I have to deal with. If I change heights by 0.2 of a foot, what's the change going to be? How is it going to impact the various models and tools and products and services I have? And I'll show you one way to do that in just a moment. But this is a very easy way, and this is all across the country, but you would really want to look at it perhaps in your own backyard. So let's look at why we want to use this GravD. What's the rationale? Well, one of the things we did at NGS is we actually computed how much it would cost to re-level the country. And we came up with a figure that was something like $1.5 billion. So it was just never going to happen. So the idea now is, by using this airborne data, certainly we need a smaller workforce. Right? It's way cheaper than leveling the country. You can't bulldoze out the geoid model, the gravity field. You just can't move that much material. So where benchmarks can easily be disturbed or destroyed, now they can't. The one area where surveyors may have a kind of a hard time getting their heads around it is that, unlike older vertical datums, which were defined by the mean sea level height at a particular benchmark, and then we go running across the country, this time it's not what you would look at and say, oh, that's an orthometric height. It's an average value for the geoid, an equal potential number that has been adopted internationally, and certainly between the United States and the Canadians. The W0 value, 62,636,856.0 meters squared per second squared. So that's kind of a different way of looking at heights. And I don't have the time in this presentation. We'll hopefully be able to do more with that in future presentations from the GNSS users group to show how that value actually converts into an orthometric height. But know that this will give us our best gravity data and the best height system, so that we can now provide these heights faster, cheaper, easier. In addition, we can track it over time, take sample measurements at strategic places where we know the geoid might be changing due to a variety of conditions. It's no longer going to be based on passive marks. Passive marks basically go away. As it says, use them at your own risk. And how will you access them? Well, you're going to access them exactly the same way you're doing things today. Maybe you're sending data to the suite of Opus tools. Maybe you like to use Opus, Opus RS, Opus Static, Opus Projects, whatever it happens to be. Or maybe you're using a real-time network, or you're doing RTK. None of that will change. You will do it exactly the same way. You just won't need passive marks. If you want to leave a passive mark behind, you want to occupy an existing mark, NGS isn't going to come around and pull them out of the database or out of the ground, But if you want to occupy them or you want to leave a passive mark behind, NGS is providing tools for that. The Opus Shared Solutions tool that they have. So if you want to put marks in the ground and share that data, NGS is providing the capacity for you to do that as well. So the marks will certainly be very, very secondary, but not used primarily. So here we see just the average positional changes, height changes rather, across the country. Minimal amount down in southern Florida, but it says 0, but won't be exactly 0 everywhere. It'll be a small amount, and many times keeping track of a small amount can be tougher than a large amount. And when you get up to the northwest, we'll start to see height changes in the range of a little bit over a meter. Let's look at one specifically, and this is one that I've just computed. Again, it's using the older geoid model, test geoid model, but it didn't make any difference because all of the gravity data was already included for the state of Maryland back in 2015. This happens to be a survey mark in the town of Gaithersburg, Maryland, not far from Washington, D.C. It happens to be on the grounds of the old International Latitude Observatory. And what I did is to take that point, Observatory RM1, there's the PID, so if you want to go look at the data sheet in the NGS database, you can pull that out. I ran it through this tool called HTDP, Horizontal Time Dependent Positioning. It showed me what the changes are going to be horizontally for 2022, so roughly about a meter, 1.3 meters in the ellipsoid height. So very consistent with what I showed you earlier for Columbus, Ohio. And how much are the orthometric heights going to change in and around Gaithersburg, Maryland? Well, roughly about 40 centimeters, about 1.2 feet. So that's a number that users in that community can hang on to and say, as they start planning forward, do I have products and services that are impacted by 1.2 feet? If yes, then I have to deal with that. If no, well, then I don't worry about it. So a little box down here that tells you how to do that. In addition, you can also quite easily do it if you're already familiar with the Opus tool, the online positioning user service. Then you can go to that, and if you request the extended output from Opus, at the very end, it will give you the predicted orthometric height for that point in the new coordinate system of 2022. So NGS is providing a number of ways in which you can predict what's going to go on in your community so that, again, you can take that into account working with your clients or your institutions. So, a couple of things. Individual horizontal and vertical datums basically go away. The 2022 will be a reference frame that will provide horizontal coordinates, ellipsoid heights, geoid heights, and orthometric heights. It'll be a single reference frame with one name. It's not yet defined, but I understand from the National Geodetic Survey that they are very, very close. They're in talks with the Canadians and the Mexicans to come up with a single name. And based on information that they've provided, we're very, very close to that. As I've mentioned in the other previous presentations, metadata will be a critical functionality to be able to migrate from the older datums to the new datums. So ensuring the integrity of your metadata, the quality of your existing data, so that you can move it forward with transformation tools that NGS will provide is critically important. NGS will provide a series of tools. One will be for the horizontal component going from NAD 83 to the new geometric datum. It will very likely be something like the existing HTDP and have an integrity of a few millimeters. The NAVD 88 tool is not yet defined, and they're going to be working on that. But it will be dependent, the accuracy will be dependent on the amount of GPS on benchmarks that are in the network. So take advantage of Opus Shared Solutions. Coming very close to the end here. So last but not least, in terms of how can you get ready for the changes that are coming about for 2022? Well, first of all, understand the rationale so that you can communicate that to others. Understand what those changes are going to be. And I've showed you just generically how big they're going to be across the country, but how to also go compute it for your backyard so you get a more specific value. You can also watch for a variety of webinars and other reports that the National Geodetic Survey does provide on an ongoing basis. Know that for those of you who are dealing with state plane coordinates, that just recently the National Geodetic Survey, in collaboration with the National Society of Professional Surveyors and the American Association for Geodetic Surveying, has just put together a draft of some legislation that will be presented to the National Society of Professional Surveyors at their upcoming meeting in a couple of months, so that states can think about how they might want to change their state legislation. And last but not least, if you have any comments or direct questions that you feel really need to be directed to NGS, you have a local regional advisor, and you can go to that page. Every state now has a regional advisor from NGS. Or you can go to Dr. Drew Smith. He's the manager for this modernization effort. So if you've got some significant questions, you can go to Dr. Smith and present them to him directly. That's the end of this particular presentation on the new datums. As always, I end with good coordination begins with good coordinates, and geography without geodesy is a felony. I hope you've found value in the 4 presentations that the Florida GNSS Users Group has been able to put together for you. We're looking forward to doing any number of future presentations on more sophisticated topics on various elements of the geodetic framework. So until then, thank you and goodbye.